Thank you, Stephen. Hello and welcome. This is On the Record. The DA's forced transitional phase has seen some of its top talent exit the party just days after the return of former leader Helen Zille. The resignation of Mmusi Maimane, Athol Trollip and Herman Mashaba have prompted DA members to either resign or jump ship. Mdumiseni Ntuli, regional secretary in KwaZulu-Natal, has confirmed that a number of DA members have joined the ruling party in the province. To talk about these developments and what it means for the DA, Lebohang Pheko, senior research fellow at NGO think tank Trade Collective, and also a political economist, joins us now. Khaya Sithole is a political analyst. He joins us on the line. A very good evening to you both, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
And I see that we do have Khaya Sithole on Skype now, so good to have you with us as well.
Thank you and good evening.
So let's just first start with whether or not that there's a consensus. Have the recent events changed the political landscape in South Africa? And is there consensus whether it's down to an individual or individuals? Ms. Pheko, let's start with you.
So, I mean, I think the idea that a whole opposition movement, and one that's been as rigorous and as consistent in its presentation, in its posture, as a very well-oiled machine, is also seen to be in some disarray, is quite a seismic shift in the way that we've experienced the Democratic Alliance and previous to that the Democratic Party. But I think it also illustrates that, like any movement of human beings and of people, there are bound to be internal contestations, and that I suppose just like any movement of people, there's also bound to be ways in which some of these contestations cannot be contained. There will be contradictions, and what we're seeing probably is what has been going on behind the scenes for quite some time. And then I think what they've been very good at is facade management, and I don't think that, I don't think that they've been immune to the sorts of shifts and creases and reversals that we've seen the last 4 days in particular. I mean, this doesn't start now. Remember that there's a time when Van Zyl Slabbert, the late Dr. Van Zyl Slabbert, his resignation over 30 years ago was a huge thing in what was previously the Democratic, well, it wasn't even the Democratic Alliance at that time. I think it was still the Progressive Federal Party. So there's nothing new in this regard, but it is new to us post-1994.
Now, we'll talk about why it's new to us in just a moment, Ms. Pheko. Khaya Sithole, what is your point of view? The seismic shift, is it going to see a moving on the proverbial chessboard, including what some have termed a black exodus, which Phumzile van Dam has slammed or slapped down as fake news?
Good evening. Look, I think the past 4 days for the DA in particular have been very dramatic, but I think also they will have longer-term implications for how we engage with politics in South Africa. The key issue, of course, underlying this issue is the question of whether race still plays a central role in our political system. Most people in the DA would prefer the answer to that to be no, but the reality, of course, is showing them otherwise. And I think what you are seeing here is that perhaps the DA has now finally realized that you may internally try to manage a situation like this, but if your public faces are going to be somebody like Helen Zille, who alienates people at every turn, it's going to be very difficult. And I think a lot of black leaders then say, look, this is clearly not a party that is willing to learn from what we've been saying internally. So perhaps let us now be more vocal in explaining what the underlying problems that we think the DA has are.
Ms. Pheko, I mean, the DA has been really emphatic in saying that it remains liberal in nature, but I want to talk about those basic tenets of liberalism and how we understand them post-democracy in South Africa. Some have said that it's very clearly conservative liberalism that doesn't have any role for black political consciousness or activism.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the kind of classical liberalism that the Democratic Alliance in this incarnation espouses is one that's of, libertarian values, bootstrap mentality, very individualistic, steeped in the notion of self-attainment, and steeped in the notion of work hard and all will be well, meritocracy, and it's not very community-centered, which is absolutely the antithesis of the way black people in particular do community, do activism, and do political work as well. It's very community-centered, and it's very much Ubuntu in all of its permutations. And And that's completely different to the individualistic and quite the privilege of individuality is that you are able to attain on your own. And I think the community center that African people have is because we come from material deprivation, is because we understand that each of our fates is tied up with the other. And I think that to add to that is that the whole notion, the whole genealogy and the history of the DA has been quite contested. So remember that this originally, 1,000 incarnations ago, this was actually a peace accord between Jan Smuts and Barry Hertzog. And what they were contending was that they needed to boost the economy in the 1930s to save the economy from being completely obliterated by the notion of class power and class mobilizing of the growing black industrial class, as in the workers' class. So this was a way, they potched this plan together to save white economic interests. So the history of the Democratic Alliance, really at best, in terms of race relations, has been quite sketchy.
Was classic liberalism ever in a position to deal with the challenges that South African society faces, especially within the context of that racial hierarchy?
It can't. I mean, this rugged sense of individualism that I'm describing versus the fact that most African people in this country are the ones who are impoverished and economically dispossessed. I mean, you don't really need to go to, Stats South Africa, HSRC, and so on and so on. We understand that the unemployment figures tell us that most people who are unemployed in this country, even taking into account the demographics, are African women, for example, people who look like you and me. So there's just no way that we can continue on this race-blind, race-denialist track and pretend that race doesn't matter. That to me is essentially quite violent and quite racist in and of itself.
Khaya, Mrs. Trollip, what do you think about this? Was the DA setting itself up as it evolved along the way? And I'm thinking as a much younger South African compared to some members within the DA who may have thought there's no contradictions in the kind of policies that they've put in place, especially when it comes to socio-economic challenges and how to deal with them.
Look, I think if you are sitting in the DA formulating policy, your question must be, are the policies that I'm formulating going to serve the nation in its current state, or will they serve it in the type of utopian state that the DA probably wished existed in South Africa? Now, the reality, of course, is that this classic liberalism works very well in societies that don't have the type of recently fractured history that we do. We're only 25 years post-democracy, and of course, the effects of that and the fractures of that are still very evident. So if the DA was going to take the position that they wanted to espouse classical liberalism, the question should have been, can it be done in the context where people still feel there is a lot to be said for just how you can get black people in theory to catch up with just the white counterparts? And I think the DA took the view that society had matured enough and society had evolved enough to actually overlook the racial dimensions. And I think it is that naivety and that sense of myopia that is actually counting against them, because for them to keep saying that race shouldn't be the determining factor and then to keep engineering new terms on how we should classify privilege, how we should classify disadvantage, it alienated more than united people. So that was really the big problem for me that I saw with the DA over the past few years. Now, even the election of Mmusi Maimane was supposed to give them this broad appeal to this new constituency of the middle-class blacks. But of course, that middle-class black cohort didn't grow at a pace sufficient to sustain a party full of contradictions like the DA. So I think that perhaps their stance was premature in relation to the state of South African politics and South African society.
Ms. Pheko, there are those who say that perhaps Mmusi Maimane was, accelerated quickly up the leadership ladder, and part of the problem is that there has been a push to limit the race debate to individual and personal experiences rather than looking at the structural inequalities that we see, which is at points when he raised it, when we look at the BEE debate, there was always a way of correlating the debate to so-called core liberal values.
Yeah, it's these nameless liberal values which I think we have not been able to give language to sufficiently, and perhaps we should have done that quite some time ago, right? Because I think think it would have helped us to understand the internal inertia and the unwillingness. I mean, Khaya calls it naivete. I just think it's an inbuilt unwillingness to actually shift. So the thing with bringing and trying to elicit a black middle class voter and just African voters at large is that once you bring them in and once you bring any other community and demographic group in, one has to recognize that your DNA and your particular, the character of your formation must change. So it's well and good to place a few black faces, to put it very crudely, in key strategic positions, including placing Mr. Maimane at a leadership position, accelerated or otherwise. But if his presence there does not translate into a policy shift, does not translate into a new nuance, a different iteration of black experiences and how those then are going to infuse into the DA and infuse their thinking and perhaps shift this kind of rugged liberal individualism, which is really not quite the way that African people do community, then it's quite pointless. I mean, you can have all the black faces, all the premiers, all the mayors, and so on in key positions. But if they're not part of building a critical mass and changing the ideas framing within, they then just become vote fodder, which I think is quite cynical and incredibly disingenuous and quite disrespectful, really, of the African vote.
So, Mr. Trollip, we've obviously seen Athol Trollip follow suit in relinquishing his positions, and the people like Herman Mashaba. What is the commonality among some of the people who have left? And some have suggested that perhaps there's been too much of a separation when discussing race dynamics, even class transformation.
Look, I think if you look at the type of individuals that have left the DA, these are the people that, from an outsider perspective, you thought, well, they are walking into this minefield where clearly race and resistance are key to what the DA DNA is all about. And there were obviously the people, particularly Herman Mashaba and Mmusi Maimane, who formed the opinion that the only way to reform the DA was to actually go in there and start really driving the message of saying, guys, if we are going to appeal to this particular electorate that has these particular features, perhaps these are some of the things that we need to do in order to actually embrace what society is rather than what we wish society is. And I think what they've seen now is that literally the re-elevation of Helen Zille back into power indicates that perhaps the DA is not only resisting going forward and evolving and resisting progress, but rather they're embracing a form of regression, because there is no doubt that Helen Zille probably has a wonderful gift in alienating people in the way she says, or perhaps just in the way she communicates things. So, of course, it doesn't really matter what she thought her intentions were on the colonialism tweets. The sufferers of colonialism were the black people. So, of course, now if you're sitting as a black person inside those structures thinking, I'm here to try and shift this party organically or otherwise and try and change it to be more responsive to the plight of South Africans, and then to have somebody who's done this thing that alienated society and pissed off black people in unimaginable terms, that person being elevated back into power, it really sets you back on that agenda, because not only are you fighting an internal battle, but it will take a very long time for you to win that internal battle. And then for outsiders, being the electorate, to see that actually there is some form of evolution, there is some form of growth, and there's a form of change within the Democratic Alliance. So literally sitting there and you're thinking, dear God, what I've signed up for the past 10 years has now been taken back 20, 30 years back. It must be self-defeating. And of course, a lot of them would say, actually, I don't have the energy to fight a structure that quite simply refuses to change itself.
Okay, so
just to pick up on that, but is it actually taking it backwards, or is it really just that it's been masked, the lack of, the transience and the lack of shifting of positioning and of really trying to adjust and to understand that this organization has to shift fundamentally in order to become almost a new organization that understands that it has a black constituency with interests that deal with inequality, that deal with historical and current dispossession, that deal with landlessness, that deal with race-based inequitable outcomes, and so on. Is it a regression, or is it just actually standing still? Has it gone back on itself, or has it really never moved forward?
Which is what I wanted to ask. Can you, within that umbrella of the liberal ideology, speak about ethnic plurality while you're still protecting the sanctity of private property and free market systems?
Well, I think, again, it does behoove us to, again, look back a bit at the origins of where the Democratic Alliance has been, the Democratic Party, the Progressive Federal Party, etc., and to appreciate that at no point did the DA in its previous incarnations really articulate very strongly on a pro-African agenda. What they were was non-racial or against explicit racism upon black people, but not per se in favor of self-rule, for example. And that was a huge debate within, up from Helen Zille and among other DA stalwarts, and in previous incarnations as well, that African people capable of self-governing. There was also a wing within the DA, what was previously the DA in the 1960s, which were opposed to Bantustans because they felt that this was too liberal and too radical a solution, whereas the other half felt that this was absolutely racist, and it's that half which then began, which was led by Helen Zille et al., and became the Progressive Party. But just bearing in mind that DNA of rabid right-wing interests versus more soft centrist liberalism still pertains within this organization. Organizations are like people. They have memory. They have ideological memory, and they pass from one generation to the next to the extent where they become the fiber. So is the DA able to shift that fiber to substantially to become something that's more responsive and more conscious of its role in an African-led country?
Mr. Trollip, do you agree with that? There are those who say, and it seems that we may have lost that line to Khaya Sithole, but we'll see if we'll get back to him. So let's continue with that train of thought, because there are those who are saying the problem with the paradox of liberalism is it tries to fix the problems, the very problems that it created. So if we look at the Democratic Alliance and the history that you alluded to and the people who are within it, can they really be part of the greater transformational trajectory in South Africa?
I don't think with that kind of genealogy, I'm not sure how possible it is. This is not to say that organizations can't change. This is not to say that political parties cannot shift. So, I mean, for example, you look at what used to be, and I have to say what used to be the Labour Party in the United Kingdom and what's now called the New Labour Party, because, it's shifted from quite far left socialist inclined ideals to quite centrist, quite market orthodox ideals, but that was really in response moving right in order to put out the conservatives. Is the DA able to then in this regard move in a particular direction? But I actually think that would mean disemboweling itself, and I hate to sound dramatic, but I think they'd have to disembowel themselves quite significantly and disavow themselves of some of the things that they have held so dear, to the extent where they say they are taking the DA back. And we must ask ourselves, taking it back to what and for whom?
So, Mr. Sithole, how do you answer that question, and who is ripe to be in that position? Mmusi Maimane, for instance, saying that he never thought of himself as a career politician, but some would argue that it's because of career politics that the DA finds itself in the position that it is now.
Look, I think the DA finding itself in this flux is, as quite correctly stated, the fact that its DNA is so firmly entrenched into its history. It becomes difficult for an organization of that nature, full of what you may call the grandees and the old guard that are in all the leadership positions, for it to actually just find this wake-up call and say, actually, if we are to remain relevant in this type of society, these are the things that we need to do. Now, the question of whether they have anyone within the ranks who can actually push that message within the DA and succeed becomes very difficult. And I think, the one reason I felt sorry slightly for Mmusi Maimane in this particular regard is that you have to then ask yourself the question of the various delegates of the DA, the various constituencies of the DA that still thought it made sense to re-elevate somebody like Helen Zille. What type of society do they actually engage with in South Africa? Because you literally have to ask yourself the question, do they actually objectively think that when they wake up and they look around in the communities that they live in and the society that we live in, that the type of policies that the DA champions and the type of resistance it has to embracing transformation. Remember, we're not asking the DA to implement transformation. They're not in government. We're simply saying that they ought to be more responsive into what the transformation effort is all about. But I think for them to be seen to be so resistant to even the small opportunities that the masses of black people have at entering the economic ladder, is not a very good idea for them. So I think what we're seeing here is that a party whose DNA refuses to adapt to the times that we live in is fast becoming a fossil of its own creation. And I think the big problem that the DA has to deal with is, where do they go next?
Okay, so
at some point in time.
Let's talk about where do they go next, because there have been names that have been touted to take over. John Steenhuisen has been said to possibly be a contender in leading the DA itself, possible chief whips, Phumzile Van Dam, Natasha Mazzoni. Is this the right kind of combination?
No, the names that you've just mentioned do not inspire any confidence. And the question that one has to deal with is the fact that the DA has to make peace that even if every single white person in the country voted for it, they would never win a general election. So they have resistance to embracing the other parts of the electorate, being, the other communities, is always going to be a problem for them. Unless, of course, they have no such ambitions of ever being in national power, which is a secondary debate altogether. But in this particular instance, they need to be able to ask themselves a question of, objectively, if we are to go campaigning in 2021 and saying to local communities that we are the best person to run your metro, to run your cities, what type of individual should be communicating that message on behalf of the DA? Is it an individual who can go to the community and say, look, our policy differs from that party in this regard, but our reasoning is as follows. And we believe that once implemented, this is how it's going to uplift you from your current economic circumstances to something far greater than what you are. Now, the DA tends to be very naive in this regard, in that in some instances, it simply says that education is the solution. Education is a long-term solution. When a person is at the age of 30 or 35, never have been employed and living in a shack, that person is unlikely to ever get back into the educational bandwagon in the first place. So how does this become a solution for their current problems? And I think they struggle even with simple messages of that nature, in that, well, for some people, education, yes, is indeed the ultimate solution because they're in the education pipeline. But some individuals are not in that particular position, and the DA struggles to actually articulate to them how the DA can possibly be the solution to whatever the prevailing issues of the day are.
Pheko, listening to Herman Mashaba, he was lamenting what a difficult coalition partner the Democratic Alliance has been, and one of the things he seems to point to was the existence of colonial nostalgia, so to speak, not only in the policy but even in the posture of those who were with him within governance in Gauteng, for instance. So. Is that ever going to change? And is there a place for black social or political activism if you are intending to be a leader within the DA?
Well, that's $1 million question. I mean, is it going to change, and can it change? I think for some of the reasons that myself and Khaya have been expressing over the last while. If a party is not willing to be adaptable, and I think adaptability is one of the keys to survival, some kind of agility, some capacity to look around at the concrete conditions, at the material circumstances, and as they shift, adjust yourself, adapt yourself to being to reflecting, to being more reflective and sensitive to what that adaptation might mean. But I think I also want to pick up on something then that Khaya says, because if the only reason that the DA exists is to be in opposition, and I think we should make that's probably a secondary debate but an important one, then by all means then perhaps this is a useful or a viable way forward for them. But if they harbor any intention whatsoever of actually leaving oppositional politics to then become the incumbents, this has to shift. So that's another existential crisis I think they find themselves in. If their only purpose that they've ever existed is to be in opposition, whether it was in opposition to the Nats and now in opposition to the ANC per se, and to a far lesser extent to the EFF, for example, as the centrist mediator between these two, then far be it for us to impose on them some huge, DNA cell transplant of the identity. But surely a government in waiting can't continue like this.
Thank you very much, Ms. Lebohang Pheko, political economist and research fellow at the Trade Collective. Thank you very much as well to chartered accountant and political analyst Khaya Sithole, who was with us on Skype. This has been On the Record.